All right, it's 1:02. So welcome back, slowly but surely, everyone. I'm just going to see if Bibiana is back and wants to go ahead and introduce me.
Of course. I'm happy to be introducing my dear colleague, Rachel. Um, Rachel is the Accessibility Advisor of the Office of the Provost and Vice Principal Academic at McGill University, promoting inclusive and accessible practices to strengthen the university's commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. In her role as an advisor and educator, she looks for creative ways to enhance accessibility in all assets of university life through capacity building and supporting others to integrate accessibility best practices in their everyday work processes. She advises members of the university's leadership in best practices in accommodating staff with disabilities and provides her expertise in accessibility to advance the university's strategic EDI goals. In her role, she has developed guidelines on accommodating faculty members with disability, established a centralized accommodation fund, and co-leads an employment equity community of practice for HR professionals within the university. So within the network, Rachel is our big expert on questions of accessibility. Just I want to outline that tomorrow we'll have some resources that are going to come out, and it's Rachel that did them through her work at McGill. So make sure to look into our networks, our social media, and we'll be sharing them and putting them also on our websites. So I'll leave you to your presentation, Rachel. Thank you so much, and hope you enjoy.
Thank you so much, Bibiana, and thank you for everyone for staying, participating and joining for this part of the presentation. The way that I've envisioned it and the way that I'm planning on doing this is I've prepared a few slides just to give you an overview of my job, what it is that I do, how this fits into the fabric of a university, and then I'm planning on turning my slides off and hopefully facilitating a more community conversation. So we're gonna have about a little less than an hour together. So feel free, to put questions in the chat as they come up. I'm happy to, read the chat and talk at the same time, and get ready to participate and engage a little bit later on. So I thought I'd start by giving you just a little bit of context as to my role and what does this look like at McGill, building on some of the themes that Melanie introduced in her part of the presentation. So the context of the accessibility advisor role, some key actions that were taken in the past year. I'll flip it to you then if you have any questions specific to my particular role in accessibility at McGill. And then I've prepared a few elements for discussion, so this can really be more of a community learning experience. So just so everyone's aware, the role of Accessibility Advisor was established in the Office of the Provost and Vice Principal in January 2020, so just about a year and a half ago, before many of our lives were completely thrown for a loop with the coronavirus pandemic being declared a pandemic in March. And the reason why it came out is there were many different pieces and layers to creating this role. So I want to recognize the labor that people who have been at the university for decades have contributed. But one of the key drivers was that accessibility was integrated as a key component of McGill's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategic Plan. So throughout the 2019 year, they held a bunch of consultations across the university to think about how McGill as a university can advance their mission, particularly thinking about supporting equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout the different pillars of the work of the university. And accessibility fit with many of the different themes and was built in as a core piece of EDI work, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this, I want to just pay tribute to the fact that the accessibility advisor role is one piece of multiple different roles and supports that exist or already existed. So there is the Office for Students with Disabilities that have been around for several decades by that point, supporting specifically students with disabilities in their academic context at the university. But really what was recognized was, you don't stop having a disability when you graduate. Many conditions or disabilities may emerge in adulthood. They can be acquired over lifetime and come with you. And so thinking about accessibility when you're an employer is also very important. And often, you know, the OSD, or the Office for Students with Disabilities, would field questions from staff or from faculty looking for support for their own needs. And when we think about the university as an employer, you know, we may have a particular idea in mind of what a university or who works at a university. But remember, we're not just talking about the professors, we're talking about large numbers of thousands of administrative staff with skills from project management to human resources to different IT and communications role, technical workers, etc. We have the trade, so universities employ plumbers, electricians, painters, carpenters, um, and landscapers, uh, technicians to work. I'm thinking about at McGill, work with animals in the lab. You have a whole range of different trades that are represented, and you also have student staff, which usually are students who seek employment, usually part-time during their studies at the university. And so this whole, ecosystem or environment provides many jobs within Montreal, within our communities, and we have to be thinking about the representation of people with disabilities within our employee cohort. So fast forward January 2020, I'm appointed to this new role. And one of the first things that I did was I really wanted to look at the research, look at what are these driving factors that support inclusive workplaces, and not just looking at that, but what does that translate to in a university context? So I wanted to share some of the things, or some of the journey that McGill has taken over the past year. And in case that's helpful, sharing different resources that were helpful to me in terms of determining this. So the first thing that we did was we looked at our guidelines on accommodating employees with disabilities. Now, accommodation on the basis of disability is nothing new. It's been a legal requirement for ages. What we did was I thought that there was an opportunity to make the wording of the guidelines clearer and more inclusive. And really a great resource for this was the Canadian Human Rights Commission actually put together a guide on developing a workplace accommodation policy. Now, it wasn't, I don't think it's specific to disability. I think it's specific to accommodations in general based on different protected grounds under human rights legislation, of which disability is one element. But I helped work with human resources to really upgrade, clarify, and word our current guidelines uh, to really set the tone so that we have a structural or policy-based support for our employees. And that, to me, was um, the first starting point. Is we have to think both of the culture of our organization and the structure of the organization, and one without the other is not going to lead to systemic and long-term change. Now, something that we introduced with these new guidelines was something that emerged through my research on best practices. And what I quickly learned was that organizations that have a centralized model for funding accommodations. So again, I'm reminding you that McGill is a employs several thousand people across the city and actually across the world. You can think about the different teams, the different units, the different faculties, the different buildings, all have their own ways of organizing. And in this context, what we didn't want was we didn't want individual units to be disincentivized from hiring and retaining talented individuals with disabilities because they were uh, because of the cost of accommodations. Now, the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, which is a really great resource if you've never heard of it. It's an American-based resource, but many of the principles are applicable in the Canadian context as long as you kind of ignore the legal stuff. But what they do ongoing research, and what they found was that, you know, this idea that employing a person with a disability is really expensive is actually not true. Or more than half the time, so 56% of the time, accommodations cost $0. And then the rest of it, you know, you have 56% cost, $0, and then of those that do have a cost, the median cost is a one-time cost of $500. Now, if you're an individual unit with a limited budget, that $500 is going to look very different than if you're a multi-level unit with a huge operating budget. And what we wanted to do was make it equitable for anyone across the university to hire and retain employees with disabilities on their team. So we established a centralized fund, which means that, you know, if an employee requires an accommodation that has an associated cost, they don't have to go to their direct manager to fund that. They can go to this fund and have their needs met, perhaps taking away that some barriers to disclosure, maybe some of the stigma and the financial aspect out of it. So we really wanted to minimize the most number of barriers possible from the outset. Now, my role also encompassed advising and support. So there's the one-on-one advising with an accessibility advisor, so that's me. And what I do is I can support people figuring out what they need in terms of individual accommodations. So I've met people across the university, many of whom are managing a new or emerging condition. who, suddenly their bodies and the types of tasks that they've been doing in the workplace for their whole career are having a disconnect. And so they're looking to me for strategies, different types of technology, different ways of doing things, and I can help them brainstorm and come up with ideas. Sometimes I also work with individuals trying to figure out how and when to disclose their disability if they want to. So, in different contexts, people might have their own reasons, and I can help them think through when and where they might want to share this type of information. And then again, I get a lot of advising and a lot of people coming asking for different resources, whether it's how, um, whether it's about accessible transportation, transcript, different types. So I get all sorts of questions. I remember, especially working in university context, I've had questions about making a field trip to examine volcanoes accessible. And I've also gotten questions about, how do I find an ASL interpreter for my event? So that just shows you like a very broad range of types of questions that I was getting and helping people think through. I don't only advise the individuals with disabilities at the university, but I also play a role in supporting HR and the different hiring managers with responding to these requests or setting up inclusive environments within their teams. And a big part of that I felt was making sure that the resources and that online reference materials were available. So I collected a bunch of things that I knew of from having been at the university. I'm also a person with a disability myself. I knew that people ask these types of questions. And so I wanted to make it easy to find. So there's the resources on our website that I've indicated here, mcgill.ca/equity/resources/disability. Um, I Part of those resources is an accessibility toolkit. I also put together a little onboarding guide for staff with disabilities, particularly for academic staff with disabilities who may also be dealing with immigration, uh, joining Montreal for the first time because we do recruit from an international cohort of professionals. So these are some of the materials that we put together. And the other thing that I co-lead with my colleague Sarah Pierre, who's the Employment Equity Advisor, is a community of practice for HR professionals at McGill. What we wanted to do was establish almost, we call it like a learning community where people who have the responsibility, who are often on the front lines working with their staff, who are usually the first person you think of when you're thinking about who do I go to for support in the workplace is often HR. And what I wanted to make sure is that HR was sensitized to some of the things that go through the heads and minds and experiences of people with disabilities when they're coming to you and provide ongoing support and training. So we don't just talk about disability, we talk about other employment equity issues, but it is something that we've been able to curate together. We have about 45 individuals across the university who are connected to us, and about 20 to 25 who attend our monthly meetings at any given month. So it's a really great model to provide ongoing education and learning within the community, which I think was really a key priority. And then related to that was community building and education within McGill itself. So I thought it was really important when we think about, barriers to retention, thinking about experiences of inclusion, and belonging is people need to feel connected, and they feel connected by meeting other people, by making friends, by feeling like their experiences are represented, that they can see themselves, that they have a future at the organization, that they're able to contribute. And so I really wanted to think about how can we do that in terms of climate. And so a few ways that we experimented with this over the past year was to look at workshop development and delivery. So I developed a few workshops for this was more geared towards hiring managers and anyone working in these types of roles across the university. So I developed a workshop on accommodating employees with disabilities and another workshop on planning inclusive events. So we can really think of setting things up from the outset as accessible and inclusive as possible. We also developed some reference materials. So Bibiana mentioned two resources that are going to be published through the network. These are based off some articles that I've written on accommodating faculty members with disabilities and responding to disclosures of disability. Again, always thinking within the university context, but these principles are not unique to McGill. They can be applied in many different areas in many different ways. So I encourage you to take a look at them, adapt them, use them, reference them, link them, share them, whatever works for you. And then really thinking about community-based events, so monthly workshops. We also established a virtual, because by then COVID had hit and many employees were, well, the majority of people were working remotely. We set up a virtual employee resource group on our internal Microsoft Teams. So that just gives you a little bit of the scope of what was accomplished in the first year of this role. I have my hopes of where this will go in the future and what it can become. But I'm just going to open it right now to see if anyone has particular questions for me about my role in this topic.